Imagine waking up and your city is gone, vaporized. For 45 years, this was everyone's nightmare. Stand in a city, anywhere in the world today. Look around at the skyline, at the people passing by, at the technology in your hands. Now, ask yourself this. Why does the world look the way it does? Why are some nations allies, while others remain adversaries? Why do certain conflicts still smolder, decades after they should have been resolved? The answer, more often than not, traces back to a single period in history. A 45-year standoff that never erupted into full-scale war between its main participants, but touched every continent, influenced every nation, and changed the course of human civilization. This was the Cold War. Understanding the Cold War isn't just about understanding history. It's about understanding the present, the alliances we take for granted, the nuclear weapons still sitting in silos, the intelligence agencies operating in shadows, the proxy conflicts burning today in distant lands. All of these are echoes of a struggle that defined the second half of the 20th century. So let's start from the beginning and trace how two allies against fascism became enemies who brought the world to the brink of annihilation. Picture this. It's 1945. Berlin lies in ruins, smoke still rising from collapsed buildings. Bodies are being pulled from rubble. The Nazi war machine has been crushed, but at a cost almost impossible to comprehend. The Soviet Union has lost over 20 million people. Every family has buried someone. Entire cities have been obliterated. From Stalingrad to Leningrad, the scars run deep, not just in the landscape, but in the collective memory of a generation. Meanwhile, the United States emerges from the war relatively unscathed on its home soil. American cities haven't been bombed. American civilians haven't starved through sieges. But American soldiers have seen the horrors of war firsthand. And the nation has developed something that will change everything: the atomic bomb. In August of 1945, 2 Japanese cities are vaporized in seconds. The world enters the nuclear age, and with it comes a new kind of fear. These 2 nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood together against Hitler. But they were never comfortable allies. They represented fundamentally different visions of how human society should be organized. America championed capitalism, individual liberty, and democratic governance. The Soviet Union promoted communism, collective ownership, and single-party rule. During the war, these differences were set aside. A common enemy made them partners, but with Hitler dead and Germany defeated, there was no enemy left to unite them. Only each other. The breaking point came quickly. At conferences in Yalta and Potsdam, Allied leaders carved up Europe like a pie, drawing lines on maps that would become borders of a divided world. Stalin, paranoid after the devastation his country had suffered, demanded security. To him, that meant controlling Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone of friendly governments between the Soviet Union and the West. To the Americans and British, this looked like empire building, like replacing Nazi tyranny with Soviet tyranny. By 1946, Winston Churchill gave voice to what many were thinking. In a speech in Missouri, he declared that an iron curtain had descended across Europe. On one side, freedom and democracy. On the other, oppression and communist rule. The phrase stuck because it was accurate. Europe was split, and that split would define global politics for the next 4 decades. So here's where American strategy crystallized into something concrete. In March 1947, President Harry Truman stood before Congress with an urgent request. Greece and Turkey faced communist threats, and Truman declared that America must support peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Congress approved $400 million in military and economic aid, but more importantly, they endorsed a philosophy: containment. The idea was simple but profound. Communism already controlled vast territories. The goal wasn't to roll it back, but to prevent it from spreading further. 3 months later came the economic counterpart. Secretary of State George Marshall announced a massive European recovery program offering over $12 billion in aid to rebuild war-torn economies. The Marshall Plan wasn't charity. It was strategy. Hungry people make desperate choices. Countries in ruins become vulnerable to revolution. By rebuilding Europe's economy, America wasn't just being generous, it was building a bulwark against Soviet expansion. The results were dramatic. Within 4 years, Western European industries produced twice what they had before the war. Cities rose from rubble. Jobs returned. Hope replaced desperation. And, crucially, communist parties in France, Italy, and elsewhere lost their appeal. Why risk revolution when prosperity was being delivered by American cargo ships? Stalin watched all this with growing fury. He saw the Marshall Plan as economic warfare, an attempt to buy loyalty with dollars. His response was to tighten his grip on Eastern Europe, refusing to let any nation under Soviet control accept American aid. The continent split, not just politically but economically. In the West, prosperity bloomed. In the East, scarcity deepened. The Cold War wasn't just about ideology anymore. It was about which system could deliver a better life. But all of this, the speeches, the aid packages, the alliances, existed under a shadow that grew darker with each passing year. The nuclear shadow. In 1949, 4 years after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The American monopoly was over. Suddenly, both superpowers possessed weapons that could obliterate cities in seconds. The arms race had begun, and it would define everything that followed. Think about what this meant for ordinary people. In America, school children practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks as if wood could shield them from atomic fire. Families built fallout shelters in their basements, stocking them with canned food and water, preparing for a war that might come with minutes of warning, or no warning at all. In the Soviet Union, citizens endured similar fears, though the state tried harder to project confidence. Both populations lived with the knowledge that their entire world could end in an afternoon. The weapons themselves evolved with terrifying speed. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan released energy equivalent to thousands of tons of TNT. By the 1950s, both nations were testing hydrogen bombs, weapons that used fusion instead of fission, releasing energy measured in millions of tons. A single H-bomb could destroy an entire metropolitan area. Cities like New York or Moscow could be vaporized, their populations killed instantly, millions more dying slowly from radiation. This led to one of the Cold War's most perverse concepts, mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The logic was chilling but clear. If both sides knew that launching a nuclear attack would guarantee their own annihilation in retaliation, then neither would dare strike first. Peace preserved, not through trust or cooperation, but through the promise of mutual suicide. It was insane. It was terrifying. And for decades, it worked. But MAD required constant vigilance. Both nations built massive early warning systems. Radar stations tracked the skies for incoming missiles. Bombers flew constant patrols, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Submarines prowled silently beneath the oceans, each carrying enough firepower to destroy dozens of cities. The machinery of apocalypse hummed day and night, manned by soldiers and technicians who understood that one mistake could end civilization. Here's the paradox at the heart of the Cold War. The United States and Soviet Union never fought each other directly. No American soldier faced a Soviet soldier on a battlefield where both knew they were fighting the other superpower. But that didn't mean there was peace. Far from it. The Cold War was fought through proxies, smaller nations that became battlegrounds for ideological struggles. Korea was the first major test. In 1950, North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet weapons and backed by Communist China, invaded South Korea. The United Nations, in a moment of Cold War irony, authorized military intervention. The Soviets were boycotting the Security Council at the time, unable to veto the resolution. American troops poured in, pushing the invaders back. But then China entered the war with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and what seemed like imminent victory turned into a grinding stalemate. 3 years of fighting killed millions, devastated the peninsula, and ended with the border right back where it started. Korea remained divided, a permanent scar demonstrating that the Cold War could turn very hot indeed. Vietnam followed the same pattern, but with even more tragic consequences. What began as a colonial struggle between France and Vietnamese independence fighters morphed into an American crusade against communist expansion. By the mid-1960s, over 500,000 American troops were fighting in Southeast Asian jungles against an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat. The war dragged on for years, dividing American society, killing millions of Vietnamese, and ending in defeat. In 1975, helicopters evacuated the last Americans from Saigon as North Vietnamese forces seized the capital. The dominoes had fallen, despite everything America had sacrificed to prevent it. These weren't the only proxy wars. In Afghanistan during the 1980s, Soviet troops fought a brutal counterinsurgency against Mujahideen fighters supplied with American weapons. In Angola, Cubans backed by Soviets battled forces armed by the United States and South Africa. In Central America, from Nicaragua to El Salvador, Cold War rivalries fueled civil wars that killed tens of thousands. Each conflict had local roots, local grievances, local actors, but the Cold War superpowers poured in weapons, money, and sometimes troops, transforming regional disputes into global battlegrounds. As the decades passed, the nuclear arsenals grew to staggering proportions. By the 1980s, the United States and Soviet Union together possessed over 60,000 nuclear warheads, enough to destroy the planet, many times over. The very concept defied logic. How do you use 60,000 nuclear weapons? Who benefits from the ability to kill humanity 30 times instead of 20? But the arms race had its own momentum. Each new weapon system demanded a response. Each technological breakthrough spawned countermeasures. Intercontinental ballistic missiles replaced bombers as the primary delivery method. These rockets, housed in hardened silos or mounted on mobile launchers, could cross continents in 30 minutes, their trajectories arcing through space before plunging down on their targets. There was no defense. No way to shoot them all down. If launched in numbers, they would get through. Cities would burn. Then came multiple warheads. A single missile could carry 10 or more nuclear bombs, each targeting a different city. Submarines armed with these missiles prowled the depths, effectively invisible, making them the ultimate second strike weapon. Even if one side destroyed the other's land-based forces, submarines would survive to retaliate, ensuring mutual destruction remained mutual. President Ronald Reagan, taking office in 1981, proposed something that seemed to defy this logic: the Strategic Defense Initiative, quickly nicknamed Star Wars. The idea was to build a shield, satellites and ground-based systems that could shoot down incoming missiles. If it worked, it would overturn MAD, giving America the ability to launch attacks without fear of retaliation. The Soviets, already struggling economically, faced the nightmare of having to match American technology they could barely afford. SDI may never have been fully feasible, but the threat of it helped push Soviet finances toward collapse. But by the mid-1980s, something was changing. The Soviet Union, despite its military might and nuclear arsenal, was crumbling from within. Decades of central planning had created an economy that couldn't compete. Factories produced goods nobody wanted. Agriculture failed to feed the population adequately. Innovation stagnated under bureaucracy and censorship. The war in Afghanistan bled resources and morale. In Eastern Europe, resentment simmered. In 1985, a new leader emerged, Mikhail Gorbachev. Young, energetic, and realistic about his nation's problems, Gorbachev introduced reforms known as glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. He allowed previously banned discussions. He permitted limited market reforms. He withdrew troops from Afghanistan. And crucially, he engaged with the West, negotiating arms reduction treaties and refusing to use force to maintain Soviet control over Eastern Europe. The consequences were swift and dramatic. In 1989, protests erupted across the Eastern Bloc. In Poland, the Solidarity movement won elections. In Hungary, borders opened. In Czechoslovakia, massive demonstrations brought down the government peacefully. And in November 1989, the most powerful symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, fell, not destroyed by armies, but torn down by crowds of ordinary people armed with hammers and joy. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. The Baltic states declared independence. Ukraine, Belarus, and other republics followed. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. The Cold War was over, not with a nuclear holocaust, but with a whimper, an empire collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. So why spend time understanding all this? Because the Cold War didn't really end, it just transformed. The nuclear weapons still exist, thousands of them, in silos and submarines across multiple nations. The alliances formed during the Cold War, NATO, defense treaties across Asia remain active and continue to shape military strategy. The intelligence agencies created to spy on each other still operate, now targeting different threats but using the same techniques. Look at current tensions between the United States and Russia, the conflicts over Ukraine, the disputes about NATO expansion, the interference in elections. These aren't new phenomena. They're echoes of the old struggle, the same distrust and competition playing out in a new century. China's rise as a global power has some wondering if we're entering a new Cold War. This time between Washington and Beijing. The proxy wars continue too. Syria, Yemen, Libya, conflicts where great powers back different sides, supplying weapons and support while avoiding direct confrontation. The playbook hasn't changed that much. Technology has advanced. Drones replace bombers, cyber attacks replace sabotage, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Powers compete for influence without risking full-scale war. The Cold War also left psychological scars. An entire generation grew up under the nuclear shadow. And that shaped how we think about international relations, about trust, about security. The assumptions made during those decades that military strength prevents war, that deterrence works, that the world can be divided into spheres of influence continue to guide policy today. Understanding the Cold War means understanding how we got here, why NATO exists, why nuclear deterrence remains official policy, why certain nations are allies while others are adversaries, why the world looks the way it does. The past isn't past, it's present, woven into every treaty, every alliance, every weapon system, every strategic calculation made by leaders today. The Cold War was 45 years of tension, fear, and conflict, fought everywhere except between its main participants. It split the world into two camps, spawned proxy wars that killed millions, created arsenals capable of ending civilization, and shaped the modern international order. It ended not with the bang of nuclear war that everyone feared, but with the collapse of one side's ability to sustain the competition. But its legacy endures. The weapons, the alliances, the assumptions, the fears, they're all still with us. Understanding that history isn't just academic. It's essential for making sense of the world we live in today, because whether we realize it or not, We're still living in the shadow of the Cold War, still navigating the landscape it created, still dealing with the consequences of decisions made decades ago in rooms where the fate of humanity hung in the balance. That's everything you need to know about the Cold War. Not just what happened, but why it matters. Not just the dates and events, but the forces that shaped our world and continue to shape it. History isn't something that happened and ended. It's something that keeps happening, keeps echoing forward, keeps defining the possible and the impossible. The Cold War taught humanity what it means to live on the brink, and that lesson, more than anything else, is one we cannot afford to forget.